Welcome to Created by Design. Today I have my sister Donna James back with us. Hi Donna.
Hi.
And if you've watched any of the older episodes, you will know that she is a quilter. She does journaling, just a number of different kinds of paper art projects. She has a lot of skills. And so I've asked her today to come, and we're going to specifically talk about the book club that you have participated in. For how many years have you been involved?
Oh, at least 10.
10 years. Okay. And tell us a little bit about what you do with that book club and how does that relate to making quilts?
Well, we read a book and then we make a quilt from the book. And the quilt that we make is kind of like a book report, and it tells something about the book in our quilt detail. And so each quilt is different. There's about 6 to 8 of us that participate. And so far we've made about 20 quilts.
Wow. So you've been doing that for how many years?
About 10.
About 10 years. And so you're each reading the book and coming up with your own interpretation.
Own interpretation. That's correct.
And it's really quite intriguing when you see the different pictures of you've each read the same book, but you've actually interpreted a little bit differently. And I've been privileged to see a few of those pictures, and it's very interesting to see the takeaway that each person has. Behind us, we have some of her quilts. We're going to show a little more in detail and some close-ups. But to get started, I just kind of want to talk to you about the process of what happens. So you read the book, and then when you start out reading, at what point do you start getting pictures in your head of what might work in a quilt?
Well, sometimes it can be in the first chapter, and sometimes it doesn't come until you've read the book and you've thought about it for a while, or even after our book discussion, you might decide, oh, this is what I'll do then. And so it can be various points. It just happens to be whatever strikes you as you're reading the book or determining what you're going to do.
So you don't have any limitations on the size?
Well, we try and make our quilts approximately 36 by 36 or larger. We had done some smaller ones, but it really seems to work a little better if they're a little larger and of consistent in size.
So you work within kind of that parameter, but you said some people have actually made king size.
Yes.
You really want to love that book if you made a queen size quilt for king size. Yeah.
That's true. And so occasionally we will put parameters, or I don't want to say the word restrictions, but ideas that everybody needs to include this in their quilt.
Okay.
We've not done that very often.
So you have a lot of freedom. So I'm going to just hold this quilt up here. And what was the name of the book for this particular quilt?
This book was called Morro Bay.
And we have a zebra on here. And I'll try to move it slowly down. So these are basically wall hangings, and you could choose any technique that you wanted when you chose to make this quilt. I'm going to hold it up close, so hopefully you will be able to see the fine detail if I hold it real still. So you were telling me, Donna, that these are 1-inch squares.
A raw 1-inch squares.
Right.
They finish up at being 1/2-inch squares.
So if you can imagine all of these, so how many squares do you think is in here? Have you ever added that up?
Oh, I think somewhere around 600.
And I would have thought maybe even more than that, because they're pretty tiny.
Yeah.
So on the back side, you can maybe see her quilting, that she followed the line of her squares for the most part. Well, not really the squares, but as the color
changed.
You changed where it was quilted. So you got to choose the technique. You really kind of got to to a little bit about the, get it turned right side up here,
That's upside
wherever the pocket is. Oh, okay. So I'll add in here real quick. There's a pocket on the back side, so you can put a rod through
Yes.
here to hang it up. And you've made how many of these quilts personally, you think?
At least 20.
About 20, which is really amazing, actually. But very, very creative. So I was talking to you earlier and was asking, when do you get the idea of what technique you're going to do on a specific quilt?
Sometimes I will have an idea of a technique that I want to try before I've ever read a book.
Okay.
And so then I will, in reading the book, I will think, oh, I could use this technique to do this particular story. And so then that's what I do. And that's what I did with this zebra quilt.
Yes, tell us a little bit. Now, tell me the name again of this particular book.
Morro Bay.
And Morro Bay, just give us a little hint about what the storyline is.
It takes place in the San Juan Islands. It's fiction. And it's part of the island has become contaminated. And then there's this group that comes in and tries to decontaminate the ground by growing psychedelic mushrooms. And in the process, they start participating in the psychedelic mushrooms. And so that's kind of the storyline. And so I wanted to do this zebra, actually do the zebra, and it was in a coloring book, and it was squares that you colored with colored pencils, and there was a color chart, and numbered, all the squares were numbered so that you knew what color to put in. And so I decided to do that in fabric.
So you followed their color guide.
I followed their color guide, and so I got this psychedelic zebra, and I thought, gee, that works
for
fine.
Psychedelic mushrooms.
Yes, yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
That is so, I think, very, very clever. So you spend how many months about once you read the book plus the quilt?
Well, we usually spend 6 months. We had started out doing 4 quilts a year, which means you only spend 3 months, and then we decided, hey, that's just a bit too much. And so we then switched to 2 quilts a year. So we have a planning, or we have time for reading the book, we have planning, we have book discussion, we talk about our quilt ideas, and then we have a quilt reveal. And at that quilt reveal, we usually have a dinner related to something in the book. So we read a book on Afghanistan, and so we looked up recipes from there, and that was fun. That was our dinner. And so we've done that with various of the stories, and so that kind of takes us then through 6 months.
Wow. And what a great way to do it, because you're learning about, well, for instance, the Afghanistan. We're going to show that quilt here. I'll insert some pictures about it and what book it comes from. But so you're really getting you're reading the book, which is always fun, and then expanding it by inserting your own creativity of what pictures you get in your head, and then socially afterwards you're meeting together with your group. And I think that is just such a neat way to get together. I'm not in a quilting group, but I don't know, maybe we could apply that to the knitting. You know,
you could
knit sweaters with a story on them. Why not, right? And I'm going to ask you some questions now, because you've put some of your quilts you've had them in fairs, and you've entered different things. And so tell us the story about, and I'm going to insert a picture here. We don't have the quilt with us, but the Alice in Wonderland story. Tell us about that.
Well, I made a quilt for Alice in Wonderland. That was one of the books that we read, and we thought, gee, that would be kind of a fun quilt, and there's a lot of ideas in the book. And so I made my quilt, and then we had them on display in the public library.
In Albany?
In Albany. Okay. And my quilt got stolen.
Oh,
and
which is so
we
sad.
don't you know, when we went to pick our quilts up from the library, that one was gone. And so then I had a picture of the quilt, and so I had my son kind of Photoshop the picture a little bit so it would be straighter and, you know, it was usable. And so then I printed it on fabric, and I cut that out and made a new quilt with that being the center. So I still had an Alice in Wonderland
And you made
quilt.
a smaller version
Yes.
of the original
Yes.
quilt. And we'll insert some pictures here because you didn't bring that one with you today, but we've got some good pictures of it, which when you see the quilt, you'll understand why somebody would say, oh, that would be so adorable in my child's bedroom. I'm sure it's in some child's bedroom someplace because it really is an adorable quilt. So, you know, who knows the value people are going to see in somebody else's work. And say, I'm going to help myself to that. That's really a sad story. And because it is really an adorable, adorable quilt. So we're going to show another quilt here that has another technique to it. So tell us this, our grandmother had a button collection, and you have some of her buttons, and I have some of her buttons, and some cousins have some of her buttons. She had quite an extensive button collection, and I've always thought about different ways to display, and you have discovered here, I'm going to hold this up real close to the camera, and we'll do some other pictures of maybe you can get see some of the buttons that she's put in on this quilt. So tell us about this book and the story behind it.
This book is Where the Crawdads Sing.
Okay.
And it was a popular read here a couple of years ago. And so I made this quilt because there was a part of the story was this girl drew all of these specimens that she found in the swamp. And so then she put them up on the wall. And so I thought, gee, this would display that like a bulletin board. And the reason for the buttons is the way these corners came together. I didn't care for the way it looked, and so I wanted to put something on there, and I thought, oh, this would be a great way to display these buttons.
So the buttons don't have anything to do with the story, but they just complete the quilt. And you've got some fancy top stitching here that you've made like a daisy chain around each one. Plus it's you've quilted on the sewing machine besides. And the back of it, we'll show the back here because this looks very swampy when you see the colors on the back of this quilt. So the back is as important as the front side. And
the only sewing machine sewing on this is just around the edges of these hexagons.
Yeah, so you made the hexagons.
They're sewn together by hand.
Oh my goodness.
So everything else is hand sewn.
So it really tells a story, but even if you didn't know the book, they're still so interesting to look at, and they're a piece of artwork that somebody would enjoy even if they had never ever read the book. Totally fun. So she's got owls and dragonflies and flamingos and flowers and butterflies. So it's a really fun small quilt, but a fun wall hanging, we should call them. They're quilted, but they're wall hangings. Okay, let's look at another one, which I think is one of my favorites because we've got the cord here for the microphone all tangled up, but you know, we're just down home folk. We don't always get too fancy. So tell us about this quilt and what book it came from.
This book is from a story called The Autobiography of Mrs. Tom Thumb. And Mrs. Tom Thumb was obviously the wife of Tom Thumb, a midget that was in real life. And the story is basically fiction. But I had wanted to make this quilt long before I read the book. And the quilt is paper pieced and it's in miniature. All of these are miniature quilt blocks. And I thought, oh my, this would be a great quilt for Mrs. Tom Thumb because it's in miniature.
Okay.
And she's only 32 inches tall. And this quilt is exactly 32 inches tall.
That's cool. Now tell us what you mean by paper
piece.
Paper
well,
piece.
you use a printed piece of paper that's got all of your shapes on that are in your quilt, and you lay your fabric on that, and you fold it over and stitch it, fold it back, then lay your next piece on, stitch it, and fold it back.
So you're totally using the paper as you're sewing. That's amazing.
Yeah, you don't cut your blocks pieces out like you would cut quilt blocks out.
So I'm going to put this up close again so you get an idea for how small some of these little pieces are. Lots and lots of little pieces of fabric that are in this quilt. It's really pretty amazing.
And you can incorporate a lot smaller pieces into your quilt when you use paper piece.
Okay, okay. So the one thing you were pointing out, let's see if it's showing up here. I think we can get this. For instance, this piece here is the same as this one up here.
And
The
this,
same design. And
this
just
one,
by
this
changing,
this one.
okay, just by changing up where the contrast pieces are to your dark and light, totally changes the design. So you've done that in several, have repeated that same pattern, like this one here is the same as this green one up here.
And amazingly, this one is the same as
I'm going to
this
hold
one.
this up a little higher. So this blue
This
one
one
down
is
here,
the same as,
we'll drop this down just a little bit so we
I get my
this one right
orientation,
here.
not that one. This one is the same as this one right here.
Okay, okay. Hopefully
This-
they can see that.
Yeah.
But it just is changing up, and that happens with the color work that I do in knitting. If you've done much doodling, making scrapbooks, you've probably experienced that if you're using a repetitive design. By just changing where your contrast color hits can just totally change the look in a quilt or whatever it is you're working on. So I think it just encourages us to look at how can I make color work. And the nice thing about this is you could really use up a lot of little scrap pieces of fabric in a quilt like this. And so this was the Tom Thumb story. And what was the name of that book again?
The Autobiography of Mrs. Tom Thumb.
So it's a true story.
It's a fictional story because it's not truly an autobiography. It's
Okay.
by another author, and it's not even considered a true biography
Okay.
because it's pretty, there's a lot of fiction in the story.
Taking some liberties with it. But what a fun quilt, and it's got so much color in it, and it's fun to look at. So even though you don't necessarily know the story, it's just a very pleasing to the eye because it's fun. That's what it speaks to me, is it just shows a lot of color changes, and it would be fun to have hanging on a wall someplace. So what else, what has it meant to you to do? Has this encouraged you to read books? Has it helped you look at books in a different way when you're reading by having made some quilts? Do you think about them differently?
It hasn't, I've always been an avid reader, but you do look at books a little differently when you're reading them for making a quilt, because you look for more ideas that really strike you, and so you read it a little differently. It has encouraged me to do more quilt making, do more wall hanging, and look for ideas that I can use in those quilts.
Okay, you had brought a quilt that you said you had an idea and you wanted to show us. This is a small quilt that she just referenced a few minutes ago. This is the Afghan story. So what was the name of this book?
The book was the Cobble Beauty School.
Back here on the back of her quilts in the corner, she puts the detailed information about her quilt. So she's
And this
very thorough.
was a true story about a woman in the United States that went to Afghanistan and started a beauty school for the Afghani women.
So tell us a little bit more
Well,
about this quilt.
the quilt is called Behind the Windows. And so everything was done behind closed doors, behind they couldn't do things in public. And so the women were really enjoying this beauty school, and so it was behind closed windows. And yet they had a lot of glitter and behind the windows, because they did a lot of makeup, and
so they were doing it in secret.
They were. And so that's what inspired this quilt.
And this is very unique to look at. And this is a small one. This is not a real big big quilt, but it has quite a story or message to it when you know this part of the story about it. This caught my eye. I thought it was pretty cool. And here is the remake of Alice in Wonderland. This is the one that was stolen. This is a remake of the one that was stolen from the public library. And it's such a cute picture. I'll get a still shot here and insert it so you can all get a really close view. But mind you, this insert piece, is from a picture that her son worked with, and you took that picture and printed the picture onto fabric and then inserted that into this quilt.
The reason for the size, this smaller size, is 8.5 by 11 is all that would go through my printer.
Okay.
And so it was on a special paper that's designed for, or special fabric that was designed for printing on. And so it's just with a regular inkjet printer. And then I put the border around it. And
it has a cute back.
Yeah, and I still had some fabric left. And so that's what I did with the quilt then. So I still have a quilt.
You still have a quilt made for a sad memory, but it was a way to preserve it. And amazing that how well the picture came out and you were able to print. And so you could take any picture. You could, and you've kind of done that with some of your quilts.
You have to be careful with the paper that you use, or excuse me, the fabric that you use to print on, because some of the fabric is not permanent.
Oh, okay.
And so you can print on it, but it will fade, and if you get water on it, it will make a water spot. This is more permanent, the fabric that I used, and you iron it, and you still have to be careful with it, but it does take the color quite well.
So on this quilt, as I'm looking at it, you've actually used grosgrain ribbon for your binding on this. So do you find, I mean, a lot of the techniques that you do here, you could do on a big bedspread or whatever. So you can use that on these small ones, but are there some things that you find that you could use on a small wall hanging that you might not do on if it was
probably
a big...
the grosgrain ribbon would be one. You know, the small wall hanging will accommodate most everything that you could do in a large quilt, or vice versa. Some of it has to do with the quantity that you have to put into the quilt.
Sure. And so you, like a big quilt, you have a filler. What do you use for your filler?
Just regular quilt batting.
Okay.
I usually use a firmer batting, and that's not quite as thick as you would use in a bed quilt, just because of the ease in putting it together.
So some of your quilts you've totally quilted by hand. Some of them you've done everything on the machine, and some you've done a combination of.
Yes.
So we have a quilt back here, the purple and black one that's just off to the left of Donna's shoulder. And that one I will show you in detail, some close-up pictures here in a minute. And that will probably be in a different episode, that you've hand quilted freehand on your sewing machine. And so you've just done all kinds of techniques. I will say this one back here that is this mountain scene, the quilting you've done follows the architecture of the mountain, and so that the water down here looks like it's actually flowing water. And we'll do some close-ups of that so you can get a better view of it. So you've really you get a lot of artistic freedom.
Yes, that's called free motion quilting, and so you just move it through your machine on however you want it to go.
Awesome. So obviously you've enjoyed doing this. You wouldn't be doing it for 6 years if you weren't enjoying it. What keeps you going? What keeps you motivated to stay? Or do you find sometimes you're bored with it and you don't? Because you've got 20 wall hangings, and so I think some of them get stowed away for a while, and then what do you change them out? So what keeps you motivated to continue to do it?
Well, it's the getting together with the group of ladies is really the kind of the motivation for it, because I don't know that I would do this without a book club,
without doing that's
and
a good point.
without meeting. But it is a real good way to become inspired and to see what the other ladies are doing, and show them what you are doing, and we talk about each other's quilt. And so it's the whole social aspect, I think, that keeps me going.
So do you feel like you get sometimes creative ideas from some of the other ladies?
Oh yes.
Yeah. Which I think is really good. I often talk about, and the group that you're watching here, these episodes, is created by design. And I just feel like whether it's quilting, whether it's knitting, crocheting, or cooking, yard work, whatever, that we feel the best or good about ourselves, I should say, when we actually are using some of that creativity that I believe we all have. We all may not be quilters, we all may not be knitters, but there is something that inspires us. And so I just continued to encourage people to find ways to find your creativity, for one thing, and how to use that.
Well, and then too, with your creativity, it means more when you share it.
That's a good point.
And so sharing is part of the inspiration. And so we in the quilt group enjoy getting together and sharing what we have done. And so that is kind of the culmination of it. Like I said, I don't know that I would do this if I didn't belong to the group.
Right,
and
that's
so
a good point.
Part of it is sharing.
And it's challenging nowadays with COVID. We have to always talk about that elephant in the middle of the room, because COVID is with us. And how do we feel comfortable about getting together with people, because I think it's so important to stay connected and yet be wise. And so this group of people, you all kind of have the same lifestyle. Probably many of you, or most of you, have had your vaccination, so you have continued to get together.
Yes.
And you've done it safely.
Yes. And there was about 6 months that we didn't meet, but we meet once a month in the evening. And so I can't always get to the meetings, but I go as often as I can.
I think that is so important. And I know I keep looking for ways to connect with people, get people together. And I just think it's a very important part of who we all are. We need that we need that connection. So thank you for bringing all of this. This is going to be the end of this episode, but we will be doing a second episode of some close-ups, some detail about what the wall hanging is, what book it has come from, the author. So if you're looking, by the way, for a good book list, Donna's always feeding me book titles, and I share mine back with her from time to time of some good books to read. And so let me ask you this: have you made some wall hangings off of some books that you really didn't care for?
Oh, some of these in this group, I didn't really care for the book, but I did do the quilt.
Right. And so do you think the quilt helped you find a meaning for you through that? I mean, did that help?
Well, one book that I didn't particularly care about was the Morrow Island book.
Okay.
But the quilt was one that I wanted to do, and so I used that book as an avenue to make that quilt.
So you had an idea
Yes.
of some techniques that you wanted
Yes.
to do. And well, that's a very good point. So that's making lemonade out of lemons, maybe. Yeah, I like that. So, well, very good. Thank you, Donna, for bringing all of this. We're now going to take some pictures that'll be in the following episode and some close-up, because it is so hard to show the detail in the format that we just did. So look to the next episode and you will see some close-up, because there is a lot of time. Donna's workmanship is really, she's a perfectionist in her workmanship, and I can say that. I'll brag on you. You might not say that about yourself, but I will say that about her. And so it's just inspiring to see her quality of work. And I was just looking at this little quilt right here and her nice and tidy mitered corners, and everything is done in real nice precision detail. So any quilters out there or seamstresses will appreciate the quality of workmanship that she has put into these wall hangings. So thanks for joining us. Now we're going to take some more pictures and have fun with that. So thank you, and I'm sure I will have her back for some other episodes. In fact, she brought some journals today too, and so in another episode or two down the road, I'm going to show those journals that you brought. So stay tuned, folks, for some more exciting things. Thanks.